Hello and welcome to another episode of Retropower Uncut. We'll start in the assembly shop this week and we're going to start with Utah because lots has happened on Utah. So because lots has happened, I'm bound to forget some of it. So I've got some trusty notes. First thing, we have received back the long-awaited batch of zinc nickel plating, which means that things like the hubs and the steering arms and various other bits that we've been waiting to reassemble have now been assembled, and we've now been able to complete the assembly of the front cross member and get all that fitted following the fitment of the engine that you saw last week. That also yielded a number of components for the rear end so that we could finish assembling various parts of the axle assembly. We've also had a batch of powder coating return from the powder coaters. We get most of the running gear, well, all the running gear parts are shot blasted, then zinc metal sprayed, and then powder coated. We've had those a few parts back. Which included the rear lower trailing arms for the Jag. It had been mocked up on a different set of arms while we did the fabrication on the body shell, and those parts, the mock-up arms, have been turned into the actual final assembly arms, and then they've been powder coated and they're back now. So they're now on the car. So the rear axle's in, the front axle's in. It's now very, very perilously close to being able to be rolling. In parallel with those parts, there's also been some progress on the air conditioning compressor. There's an issue with the fitting of the lines to the air conditioning compressor because it was quite a compact installation around that area. We've had to change the way that those lines come out of the compressor. There's a bolt-on sort of sub-block that goes onto it, and we couldn't use the normal fittings basically in that. Because a long story short, we couldn't use the normal fittings in that. So we've actually machined up some adapters, and then we've TIG welded those adapters into the sub-block that bolts onto the compressor, which gives us the means to connect suitable lines to it, which will clear the chassis rail and fit where we need them to fit. So that solves that. The gear shifter housing, again, has also, with the plated parts for that have arrived, so that's now been fitted as well. So the gear shifter's now in the car as well. The fan, we were awaiting there was a question mark with the fan. When the metalwork was done on the car, we made a mock-up radiator, and then we've covered this before, but in the Utah series, but the mock-up radiator was then sent to Concept Racing, who we use for our sort of super pretty alley welding. They've made the radiator, but we had a bit of a conundrum with the fan, in that the fan that we specified at the metalwork stage, although SPAL listed, we use SPAL for all our cooling fans, although SPAL listed this particular fan, which was the most powerful fan we could find that fitted in the space available at the mock-up stage, we later discovered that fan wasn't actually available. Although SPAL listed it, it's not actually available from SPAL, strangely. And then there were two alternatives, one with a slightly smaller motor, one with a slightly bigger motor. But we weren't sure whether the bigger one would fit. So we'd held off actually putting the fan mounts onto the radiator until we got the radiator in the car with the ancillary drive on the front of the engine, so we could then do a final check and make sure that fitted. And as it is, we could fit the larger motor, so that's what we've gone for. So we've now done the brackets for that. And as a little aside to that, as you'll be able to see, there's a top tip for anybody out there using Autodesk Fusion 360, which is the CAD software we use. Top tip, if you're trying to make brackets to fit something fairly simple and two-dimensional that might be tricky to measure. Now, a radiator would be very easy to measure, but a super fast way of doing that templating for 2D parts that need to be that you want to cut using some sort of computer controlled process. A really good way of doing it. If you just take a photograph square on to the part you're trying to do the templating on, import that photograph as a canvas into Fusion 360. You scale it when you import the canvas in. You only need 2 points with a distance between them to scale it. Scale that part in, and then you can literally use the canvas to draw the part you want on top of. Just pick the lines where you want to put them visually on that canvas, and because it's to scale, the brackets you've drawn are also scaled to that drawing. It's super simple. I'm sure I'm teaching everybody to suck eggs, but it's just a really easy way of making brackets using the canvas function in Fusion 360. So as it happens, that's how I do it very quickly. You know, it's like 10 minutes start to finish probably to just draw the brackets up for the fan in Fusion. That, you know, the actual drawing part of that job is just super fast because you just drop the photograph in, draw the brackets, done. Then obviously we then take that file in the sheet metal function, put the folds on it in Fusion, and then take the convert that to flat pattern it, convert it to a DXF, take it through and cut it on the CNC plasma cutter, and there you've got a set of brackets. But for people working from home on their project cars, Fusion 360 is free to sort of non-commercial users. You can still draw those brackets. You can do everything we've done here, and then just give that file to a laser cutting company. So just an aside really, but just a handy little tip if you weren't already aware of it. Other things that we've done, we've got the anodised parts back from Majestic Anodising. So we've now fitted the steering rack with the anodised, the big aluminium mounts that we'd had machined by Alitech before. They've now been anodised, so steering rack's all mounted up. And again, using the steering arms that we made from that Alitech machined for us from EN24 billet. They were actually the steering arms that we had made to correct. Again, if you've been watching the Utah series, a rack conversion on a Mark II Jaguar, if you don't think it through properly and you don't modify various things, you end up with bump steer issues. We've designed new steering arms for it to correct those bump steer issues. We've had those machined in EN24. They've now been zinc nickel plated. They're fitted. So now we've got the complete steering setup done. The oil filter head is now fitted, and we've done the hoses for the remote oil filter. So that's sorted now. And James has been working on leathering the top dash, and he's just started work. Dean's done the actual leather work. James has done the templating work and has also now fitted the machined dash windscreen vent bezels that we had machined. They've been anodised as well, and then they've been fitted to the dash top. That's all now ready to fit, and he's now working on between him and Dean, they're now working on the lower dash, getting that ready. Just check whether I've covered everything. Another small item that we've done is we've also sorted out I think you'd call them a hockey stick trim, the trims that go down at the front edge of the doors on the A-posts that carry the sealing system for the front doors. There's like a separate trim section. They needed a few little tweaks to fit. Those tweaks have been done, and they're now fitted, ready to carry the seals when we fit all the door seals. So they're now ready to go. And I think, and the disc brake, the rear disc brake conversions currently, the current work in progress. We're going through the work on that at the moment. We wanted to do a disc brake conversion on this. We've used a similar conversion in the past on 4HA axles, so it's very similar to the setup on this. And we're actually using Nissan 200SX calipers. They have a handbrake mechanism built in, so you don't need a separate shoe-in drum style handbrake. And they're just a convenient caliper, sensible sized disc, and we're using the Nissan 200SX discs as well, which conveniently have the right, within a fraction, the correct PCD to bolt onto the wheel PCD on the Nissan discs is the wheel stud PCD is the correct PCD for the disc bolt PCD on a Mark II Jaguar rear hub. So that conversion, you just need to machine down the register that the disc sits on the hub, which has been done prior to plating, and now then the disc bolts straight onto the hub, and then the caliper with some brackets that we've made then bolts onto the axle, and it's just a neat setup with an integral handbrake and discs on the back. It's quite a neat setup as an alternative to the normal Mark II Jaguar setup, where the calipers are pretty archaic. They're not a very modern design, and the handbrake design's not great either. So we were keen to try and modernise that whole setup, hence the reason for the change of parts there. So yeah, that's progressing quite well. Gordon's car, We've done it's now off the ramp, so we could do the jobs which Carol mentioned last week that we needed to get onto once we could actually open the doors on the car. So the car's now all back rolling, pretty much ready to be tested, but we've got to finish off the wiring on the steering. We've got to mount a couple of items inside under the dash, and we also wanted to put a shroud round the power steering assistance motor just to make that look a bit neater, because part of it's visible. So we wanted to make that look a bit neater. So we've 3D printed a shroud, and James has painted that, so that all looks satin black. So that matches the finish of the rest of the components under there, and that looks really neat now. It just without covering it in sort of anything too showy, it just makes a neat functional appearance to the motor setup. Just make sure I haven't missed anything. Oh, and the heat shield. I knew there was something else. Yes, one of the other issues we've had is even with the heat protection on the bonnet does get extremely hot. Now, it's not caused any problem, any trauma to the bonnet yet, but we're getting a bit concerned that the bonnet does get extremely hot. So we're actually adding a heat shield, which is mounted to the sort of strut brace assembly. So we're just doing a few little modifications there, so we can put a heat shield on that just to take the heat stress out of the bonnet, because we don't want to damage the carbon fibre in the longer term or cause any sort of defects to arise there in the future. Obviously, once the car's in traffic, that could be a potential problem. I mean, the car has been used quite a lot in traffic, but there's a concern over the heat rising there. So that's a solution for that. I think at that point, hopefully I haven't missed too much. I don't think I have. We'll move on to next door and have a look in the fabrication area, where there's lots and lots occurring, lots of dust being created, and lots of welding going on. I'll have a quick drink of coffee actually on the way. It is a quiet door, isn't it? It's a wonderfully quiet door. Aha, right, well, here we are at Morris. The key major piece of progress here is that Stu has, I believe now, finished, in fact, fettling the wings. It's been a slog, as this stage in any process, always in any sheet metal work always is. The final phase of getting it ready for the body man to follow on from is quite a big process. But all the wings are now tapped up and filed up. We're happy with the finish on all of that. As far as I'm aware now, we're happy with everything there. Stu's done a great job of that. And yeah, all four corners are now basically at the stage where they're ready for bodywork. The front end, we've revised the method of hinging of the bonnet. We're front hinging the bonnet for various reasons, but we're mounting the hinge assembly to the front tube framework. You can see one of the hinges there. Stu's done a bit of templating work and come up with a cardboard template for the shape of the hinge needed to clear the slam panel. He's also fabricated the slam panel that it leads neatly onto, which is a nice pressed steel item with pressed swaged holes in it, just to keep the weight down and make it look visually appealing. That will also mount the top of the radiator. But then the hinges have to go around that to enable the bonnet to hinge up and clear that. So Stu's done a little profile. We've drawn that on CAD and CNC cut those. So now we've got to weld some bosses on to mount that, and we're going to do some little bronze bushes for the bonnet hinges to rotate on. So he's currently working on putting the steel work into the front corners of the bonnet to mount off the flanges in these corners to pick the hinges up. And then we've got to work on the latching mechanism at the back, which we're thinking, the thinking currently is pit pins on that, but that's the next phase. First phase is getting the hinge assemblies right. We wanted to make sure we've got the wings completely finalised before moving on to that, because we've got to set the exact shut lines on the bonnet. We're pretty happy with where all that's at now. So really the next phase on this is going to be taking it off the jig, which at the moment the plan is Monday. This should be coming off the jig. So yeah, that'll be really. All of us are greatly looking forward to seeing this on its wheels. The cars look so different when they're on the jig to when they're on their wheels. We're really looking forward to that situation. So that'll be yeah, next week all will be revealed. So yeah, so that's where we're at on the Morris. Moving on to Chevette. As you can see, the car's now on a rotisserie. This has enabled the next round of work, the sort of final round of body shell work to be undertaken. I just need to check my list just to double check. Yeah, the first and most important one was the finishing of all the underside welds, because the car had been on a jig and then on a trolley and briefly on the ramp, but all of that time basically underside pointing downwards. Most of the grinding and trimming and tidying work is pretty unpleasant done that way up. So Scott's made up the mounts, mounted it onto the rotisserie, so he can spin that round, trim off and dress all of the underside welds and tidy the whole underside of the car and get it all looking decent, making sure any little bits of weld finishing that were under there have been done. There's a few jobs like the front edge of the 4 link boxes, the axle trailing link boxes, the front edge of those where it protrudes through the floor needed skidding into the drop section of the floor pan ahead of them. So that's now been done. Just check my list again, make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, yes, the bulkhead needed a little bit of modification. The water outlet on the rear of the cylinder head on the C20XC Vauxhall engine is usually fouls a bulkhead in a rear-wheel drive application. They can be blanked off, and in a lot of applications they are blanked off. It's nice to keep that flow from that end of the cylinder head if possible. It's not the end of the world if you don't, but if you can keep that flow, it does keep the cylinder head temperatures more even. And it also gives you the option to run a heater from them, which we do want on this car. So that we've just done a little modification just to get us a bit more clearance on that pipe. There was room, but it was a little bit tight, and if you can get a bit more clearance, then go for it if you can. And I think that is pretty, the various little bits on the transmission tunnel that needed finishing off, particularly near the back. Again, there was some parts that were difficult to access earlier on that needed tidying. And there's also the tidying of the original factory area. I think we mentioned at the stage of blasting the car that we were quite surprised that the front tunnel section on the Chevette, on an automatic shell, this was an automatic shell, the General Motors production modification to put that tunnel in was to simply gas torch out a section of the non-automatic car's floor pan and then stitch weld in. Literally, it's just MIG stitched in a pressing to clear the automatic gearbox, and the edges, the ragged flame cut edges of the original floor pan were just left, and well, they were daubed in sealer with a brush, and that was it. But they were quite ragged and not very tight. So anyway, that's all been tidied back to the step in the auto tunnel now. So that's all quite neat and much improved on how it was. And another thing, the cross members, you'll see the cross members mounted back up in the shell. That's so that we can mock up the steering column and just refine the hole in the bulkhead for the steering column to pass through. It's slightly different in the way it's different to a normal Chevette in that we're using the Corsa B electric power steering conversion, which Scott's done the mounts on the bulkhead for. That means that there is no outer column going through the bulkhead anymore. It's just the inner column which rotates. So we're actually making a little rotating seal that goes in the bulkhead for that to go through to enable it to rotate but keep the water out. So that's why that's all sort of mocked up in the shell again at the minute, is to enable us to position that accurately and get the little mounts put into the bulkhead for the rotating seal to go into. So that's work in progress still on that at the moment. And moving on, I've been largely working on the Jensen, and we've made some pretty good progress on that. Got the rear steelwork for the axle assembly is now done. That's all in. There's a couple of little bits to finish underneath which will need to be done on the rotisserie when the chassis gets put on a rotisserie slightly later on in the process. Once it can come off the jig, then I'll spin that round and do some finishing off underneath and tidying up of a few of the hollow sections that I don't really want to weld upside down if I don't have to. The rear seat pan sections are in now. They both have a reinforcer on the back, which mirrors the original Jensen reinforcers, but is on a different angle. And I think Carl mentioned last week there's effectively a box section that goes across between the turrets, which are no longer turrets really. There's nothing going into them, but they made sense from a structural point of view to leave there, as they're a good point to tie the bulkhead into. So we've left the turrets because they make a good structural point, but they're now tied together across their bases by a box, which forms that step that you can see in the rear seat area and the rear seat backrest area. And then there are two diagonal box section reinforcers that go from the ends of the chassis rail tubes up to that box section right at the base of those turret sections, which also ties into the new reinforced rail section that goes over that's all now part and parcel of the Jensen rear chassis blades, and that carries the four rubber V-mounts that the Jaguar rear end, the Jaguar IRS setup mounts into. The bulkhead's part done at the moment. The reason it's sticking up at the minute is I've got to fold the top and bottom, but I've run out of time. The fingers need swapping around on the folder, so I haven't folded that bit yet. But yeah, that'll be the rear bulkhead. That's going to have a couple of little reinforcers in it. And then there's a bit of finishing off to do on the sides of the rear seat pans where your bum actually goes when you're sat in there. But that's progressed quite well now. So next week, a little bit of finishing off in that. I've also, as an aside, I've also cut out the front part of the boot floor. Again, Carl mentioned last week we were pondering the best plan on that. Decided to cut out the forward half of the boot floor because we're modifying the fuel tank design. We're going to do a new fuel tank design. These were carburetted cars originally. They used a very flat fuel tank, as a lot of carburetted cars do. For fuel injection, it makes much more sense to try and use a taller, slimmer in the fore and aft direction fuel tank, so that you have less fuel surge to try and combat using swirl pots, etc. What we do is we will normally build a swirl pot or a surge tank into the bottom of the actual fuel tank, so that we combat fuel surge that way. But it also makes sense if we can squeeze the fuel tank up, forward and up, which is what we're going to do. It's going to the upper half of the fuel tank is going to sit between the rear turrets, and then that'll drop down into the forward half of the boot floor where we've now removed that part of the boot floor. So that's work in progress as well at the moment. As I say, next week I'll be getting the forward half of that finished off, and then moving on to engine mounts and getting that, carrying on with getting the engine mounted up. So I'm quite looking forward to that, because it's going to progress quite quickly on that. The engine mounts don't look too challenging, so it should be it's a relatively easy phase compared to the rear half. Famous last words. And moving on, I think from there it's on to the Mustang. I'll swing through here, and basically that's a lot more sanding. Is the theme of the day on that. I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, I believe. Lots and lots of not particularly great panel gaps. So Gaz has been working, well, several of us have been working, but particularly Gaz has been working on perfecting the panel gaps. There were a few areas. The big long gaps were actually all very good, but some of the detail areas, the very tops of the doors, we weren't really happy with, and quite a bit around the front lamp surrounds. The lamp surrounds are not very clever, really. They're a Mazak cast item, and they're not quite the right shape, really. So we've been reshaping those a little bit to get the fit to the bonnet improved, and getting the fit to the grille surround improved. We've checked the trims that go around the grille and the grille itself. Not that that has any influence on the fit of anything, it turns out, but we wanted to check it actually did fit. And we've checked the trims that go around the grille area, check that those fit. They do, in the loosest possible term, but they fit where they're supposed to fit. And also we've checked we weren't quite happy with the fit of the wing to the door top on the near side either, so we've had a little fiddle with that as well, got that improved now. And the bonnet to scuttle, bonnet to wing is all good, so it's very, very close now. I think there's still a tiny bit more to do on the headlamp surrounds. At the front end, we're still not quite happy with how they line up with the bonnet. It's just a bit more sanding and a bit more filing and a bit more fettling required there just to get that right. And then I think we're getting pretty close to everything being straight. Gaz has obviously got to carry on. He's mixing the alignment misery with the blocking monotony. He's mixing the two tasks together. So he's doing a bit of alignment, and then he's going back to going down the grades on the straightforward blocking part. So keeps the job mixed up slightly. so he doesn't get, you don't get too snowblind doing it that way. But he's getting through it now, and we're certainly we're not there yet, but it's starting to get close. I think that probably covers everything we've got to cover this week, I would say. So I shall see you again soon. Take care, and like and subscribe. See if you can get that on lip reading.